This video is made possible by Photo Consumer Products. Hey, what's up guys, it's Mary from Black Tech Malaysia and I hope everybody is well and healthy staying indoor, and this video is about why I use these three lenses. Now before I start, I want to get into why I choose these lenses and how I choose these lenses. Particularly this video might be useful for people that might want to go into photography, or they are new to photography, or anywhere in between. Now I have three considerations when it comes to buying a lens. First thing is affordability, usability, and compatibility. Affordability is pretty much self-explanatory. The cheaper the lens is, the easier for you to buy and the better for your ROI, your return of investment. So if you're going pro, it's much better for you to go into something that is much more affordable for you to recuperate a bit of fun from there. Basically, you have lower risk of wasting that much amount of money into a gear that you might or might not make back your money. You should also consider how much you are charging your client before you're buying a lens, because if you're charging a very menial fee, it's much harder for you to get into really pro lenses that is dedicated for full frame cameras or really high resolution cameras. So you should think about how many jobs or how long it will take you to make back that amount of money that you invested into that lens. The second thing you should consider is the compatibility of the lens with your camera body. There's a lot of camera lens and bodies out there, so you might run into trouble where you don't know whether this lens may be compatible with this brand of body. So let's say if you are looking for this particular lens that is made by Nikon and you only have a Canon body, you should know that probably there's some problem right there. For example, if you're using Sony cameras, then you should probably buy a Sony lens or Sony glass. And if you're buying Canon lens, then you should buy a Canon body. Now you might run into a problem where you're trying to adapt a third-party lens onto your camera. You'll only be able to do that if you are using one of these mirrorless cameras that has no mirror in between the lens and also the sensor. Now these cameras are not called DSLR anymore, they are called mirrorless camera. Now this opens up a lot of opportunity for you to buy third-party lenses. Let's say for me, example is the Voigtlander series. I'm able to buy Voigtlander lenses and put it onto my mirrorless camera. Another problem that you might run into is that how do you know these third-party lenses is able to adapt onto your camera? You can basically solve the problem out by just going to Lazada or eBay or Shopee to just Google the lens that you want to use to the body that you want to use. Basically for me in this point is Voigtlander to Sony, or because most Voigtlander lenses are made for the Leica bodies, I can type in Leica mount to Sony. The third thing is usability. Now how useful is that lens for you? If you're buying a very expensive lens, it better be very useful for you in terms of you'll be able to use it constantly and not this one or twice niche situation that you are using it. And for me, I don't buy a lot of lenses. I buy these specific lenses that I know that I'll be able to use it comfortably in all of these situations that I usually use in, and I make sure these lenses be able to do the job that I need to. And now let's finally get into what are the lenses that I use on my camera. So let me first tell you the camera that I'm using currently. I'm using the A7 III currently that is recording me, and I'm having a A7 II here that I use for backups. Now these two cameras, the A7 III and the A7 II, are practically the same camera with the same sensor, but maybe a little bit of an improvement in terms of autofocus and maybe low light performance. But when I put the usual lens that I use on it, they practically perform almost the same. Now with that said, if I put any manual lenses on them, they perform exactly the same. Maybe a little bit better in terms of low light, maybe noise performance, these kind of things, but usually they perform almost the same. The difference being between these two cameras is the video recording capabilities and also the autofocus capability. So that's the camera body. What about the lens that I use? Now these are the three lenses that I have in my bag 100% of the time. The 40mm, the 15mm and also the 85mm. The 40mm and also the 15mm is both from Voigtlander. Now you might be asking, what are these lenses? Why they look so weird, and are they even autofocus? No, they are not autofocus, they are manual focus only. So why do I use manual focus lens if you're asking? For me, taking picture is a creative process which I love to take it slowly, methodically, and maybe just more precisely. Now in this situation, I prefer my lens to be more tactile, which I can then slowly compose and frame my subject nicely and methodically. So you can see that taking pictures and this creative process is a very tactile experience for me, and these lenses really helps me in that regards. Now I hear you, isn't it much slower using a manual focus lens compared to an autofocus lens? I will reply, if you're confident enough with your manual focus, you have nothing to be afraid of. Because in times like a low light situation, it's much faster for you to use a manual lens than an autofocus lens, where the autofocus lens will just hunt all night long. And yes, initially you might get a lot of misfocused shot, and that's okay because that's part and parcel of a photography journey. Now, how often you miss a shot and how often you get the shot nicely framed and focused is a testament of your own personal skill. As you progress as a photographer, you see that the ratio for your nail shot will increase over time. Okay, let's talk about the 40mm. The 40mm is an in-betweener between the 35mm and also the 50mm. The 35mm tends to give you a very phone-like perspective, and most phones out there adopts 35mm as their standard camera. On the other hand, we have the 50mm, which is a little bit more telephoto, and the 50mm is a very standard focal range for a lot of digital camera, where they are said to be not too tele, meaning zoom in, or not too wide. So that's why I opted for a 40mm, where it's not as wide as a 35mm, which giving me the phone view, and not too tele like a 50mm, where it's a bit difficult to use in a sit-down situation. And this specific 40mm from Voigtlander gives me a f1.4 aperture, where it gives you a very dreamy and very beautiful background, a very blurred background, which a lot of people desire. I find that if I'm going out with only one lens, this is the lens to go, because it's really comfortable to use in maybe a table situation, in a cafe situation, a very tight situation. It's still very comfortable to use, but it's still able to give me a lot of this portrait look that I really enjoy. Next up is the 15mm by Voigtlander. Now this lens is a small but mighty beast because it's wide angle, it's super wide, it's hyper wide, it's 15mm, meaning you'll be able to see a lot of the room and a lot of the surroundings in one picture. And the best part yet, it comes in this small form factor. It's super tiny compared to a lot of wide angle that I use. Yes, you are giving up brighter aperture for this small compact size, but I don't mind, because I really rather be able to carry this small lens with me everywhere I go rather than a big bulky but bright lens and heavy lens in my camera bag. Now, this lens might not be the cheapest lens I have. By the way, the 40mm is the most affordable lens I have in my bag, while still being the most used lens in there. Now, as I said, this lens might not be the cheapest lens that I have, but it gives me tons and tons of resolution, tons of sharpness, end-to-end corner is sharp all the way through. So you see me using this lens in 100% of my property work when I'm going for a property shoot, because it's so wide and so small, so compact, that I can easily take this wherever I go and fly it on a gimbal. And just as a side note, the 40mm is a rangefinder lens, meaning it comes with a lens tab here, which you can see. It's supposed to give you a very comfortable position to shift the focus with just one finger. This 15mm on its own doesn't come with a lens tab, but I've added my own lens tab on here, which I bought from eBay. This allowed me to be able to comfortably shift the focus with just one finger, while my other finger may be supporting the camera, which lowers the weight and lowers the fatigue of my hand. And lastly, I have a workhorse, which is the 85mm, which I use for maybe most of my portrait work. And in some situation, let's say in a wedding, I'll need to be able to perform quickly and reliably, and that's when I use an autofocus lens. The 85mm is a rather telephoto lens, which it gives you a very zoomed-in perspective, but it really does give you a really dreamy background and make sure your proportion looks the best. In most of my portrait, I've primarily used the 85 over anything else. Now, on occasion, I do use the 75mm from Voigtlander and also the 50mm f1.2 from Voigtlander. So that's it. That's my lens and why I use them. Now, what lens you use is completely up to you. I'm not trying to say, hey, this is the must-use lens in this situation and this is the must-use lens in this situation. No, I'm not doing that. But I'm just giving you a few recommendations and maybe a few tips on how you should choose your lens. Aside from that 3 factors I mentioned in front, the other smaller factors that I do look into maybe could be the characteristic of the lens. Basically, how would the lens perform in this kind of situation? How would the background blur be like in this kind of situation? And yada yada yada. Each lens, particularly these Voigtlander lenses, have their own characteristic, they have their own behavior, they have their own quirks. In some situations, they might perform differently than others, and maybe the final image might even be slightly different from maybe another lens that have the same focal range. And these kind of things are the things that makes you stand out maybe a little bit more and be different from other Instagram photographers. So that's why I subscribe to a little bit of weirder things, because it really makes your personality stand out that little much more. So at the end of the day, you are the one that knows what you shoot the most. I personally, I have different sets of lenses which I use for different situations. If I'm doing photography, these are the 3 lenses that I use. If I'm doing videography, I have another set of video lenses that I will maybe discuss a little bit more next time. But that's it. So if you're interested in buying any of these Voigtlander lenses, maybe look up Voigtlander Malaysia or Photo Consumer Product on Facebook. And again, this is Mervin from Black Tech Malaysia. I'll see you in the next one.